In the stillness of Bel Air, a house stood, as an enigma, its sharp, glassy exterior gleaming like the cold heart of the city, surrounded by pristine white columns. From its hilltop perch, it offered a vast view of Los Angeles. It seemed like even the stars had retreated, overshadowed by the magnitude of what lay below. As it was called, the Brown Estate was where whispers lingered in the air and tales spun in the shadows. But inside its high walls, silence reigned supreme. It was a mansion of solitude, and yet something was missing. Brandon Smith was a man accustomed to silence. His life, sculpted by wealth and ambition, was a carefully curated routine, a life that revolved around numbers, meetings, and strategies, not warmth or affection. His home, an architectural masterpiece that spoke more to the eyes than to the soul, mirrored the emptiness that often echoed through the corridors of his life. Most nights the estate felt more like a museum than a home. The marble floors, the grand staircases, and the sweeping views were all meant to be admired from a distance, but they were never truly touched. In this kingdom of opulence, there was no room for weakness, no space for emotions that might disrupt the perfection of the image. And yet in the deepest recesses of that perfect world, there was a child who cried in the silence, was restless in the midst of luxury, and longed for something more than the cold embrace of machines and systems designed to quiet her. Her name was Sofia. Sofia was his daughter, barely 1 year old, yet she had already inherited the weight of his absence. Brandon had never reasonably known how to be a father and present in a way that mattered. His late wife Emily had always filled the gaps until she was gone, leaving Brandon alone with the echoes of a life he wasn't prepared to lead. Since Emily's death, Sofia had been a puzzle, a mystery that Brandon didn't have the answers to. No one in the house seemed to be able to soothe her. The night team, the robotic white noise system, none of them could do what a father or birth parent should have been able to do. And then there was Gianna. Gianna Martinez had worked for the Smith family for a few months, but wasn't a nanny. She wasn't even hired for that purpose. She was part of the household support staff, quiet, invisible. Someone meant to blend into the background and never disrupt the carefully orchestrated flow of life at the estate. But Gianna had a gift that no one else seemed to understand. It wasn't just that she could calm Sofia when others failed. It was more than that. Unlike anyone else in the house, Gianna understood the sounds of a child's pain. She had lived too many years in the foster system in homes that never quite felt like home. She had heard too many cries in the dark cries that spoke of abandonment, of loneliness, of fear. And in Sofia's cry, Gianna recognized something that no one else seemed to see: the sound of a child, yearning for connection, for something real. It was a fabulous night when Gianna first stepped in to soothe Sofia. She had been sitting in the dimly lit nursery, watching the automated skylight flicker, casting a silver hue over the room. Sofia was in her crib, kicking and squirming, her tiny hands clenched in distress, her face flushed with the kind of terror only a child could experience. The room, despite its grandeur, felt cold. The sterile atmosphere of the house didn't help the baby feel safe. Gianna stepped closer, her sneakers barely making a sound on the marble floor. She reached down gently, her voice barely above a whisper. "Shh, Sofia, it's okay. I'm here." At first there was nothing, no calming. Sofia's cries deepened, becoming more desperate, a sound that cut through the room's silence like a blade through velvet. But Gianna didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. She had been through this before in other places, in different homes with other children. She understood that sometimes it took someone who cared enough to stay. She bent down, lifting Sofia gently from her crib, pressing the child against her chest. Gianna's voice, soft as silk, began to hum something old, something familiar. It was the lullaby her own foster mother had once hummed to her when she was a scared, lonely child in a strange house. It was part lullaby, part prayer, a simple sound that carried all the warmth of 1,000 unsaid words. And just like that, the crying stopped. Sofia's body relaxed, her tiny hand gripping Gianna's shirt as if to reassure herself that this warmth and comfort were genuine. Her head tucked into Gianna's neck, and there was peace in the room for the first time that night. Gianna forgot where she was for a moment. She forgot about the house. She forgot about the cameras that watched her every move. She forgot about the unspoken rules that defined her place in the hierarchy of the Smith household. At that moment, it was just her and Sofia, two souls connected through something pure and unspoken. But that peace was fleeting. The door slammed open. "Put her down." The words cut through the room, sharp and commanding. Brandon Smith stood in the doorway, his towering figure framed by the harsh light from the hallway. His icy blue eyes locked onto Gianna's arms, where Sofia was nestled, her tiny body now relaxed like never before. Gianna froze her breath, caught in her throat, and the soothing hum she had been singing halted mid-air. I didn't mean she wouldn't stop crying. I said, "Put her down." Brandon repeated, his voice cold and controlled, his words laced with authority. Sofia stirred in Gianna's arms, sensing the tension before she could understand the language. The peace she had just found was starting to break her small body, tensing again. Gianna tried to explain, her voice softer now, apologetic, as she carefully rocked the child back and forth. "I wasn't going to hurt her," she said. "She was just scared." She's always scared," Brandon snapped, stepping closer, his eyes darkening with frustration, "because strangers keep putting their hands on her." Gianna looked up, her dark eyes meeting his, briefly, intensely. She didn't back down. Gianna said she doesn't need systems, and her voice is low and steady. She needs skin. She needs warmth. She needs someone to stay. The words hung in the air between them, like an unspoken challenge. Gianna was not just a member of the staff. She was a person, someone who understood in a way Brandon hadn't yet been able to what Sofia truly needed. Brandon reached for Sofia, his hands stiff and mechanical, as if he were handling something fragile or dangerous. The moment Sofia left Gianna's arms, she whimpered, her small hands reaching out in the air, desperately trying to cling to the warmth she had just found. But Brandon didn't stop. He walked out of the room, cradling Sofia awkwardly in his arms, her cries growing louder with each step. The silence returned to the room. It was deeper now, more oppressive, filled with the stillness that only a broken moment could create. Gianna stood there momentarily, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. When the baby's cries had first filled the room, it was as though the sound of them had opened something in her, a memory, a feeling she had long buried. But now, as Sofia was taken away, the silence left a void in her that felt just as deep, just as consuming. She whispered to the empty crib, the words barely audible but full of truth. Gianna said softly that she doesn't cry because of me, her voice raw with emotion. She cries because you don't see her. If this story touched you, if you felt the weight of every word, the depth of every emotion, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment below. Let us know what you think. Would you have stayed like Gianna did? Or would you have walked away? Follow our channel to continue this journey with us as we unravel the next chapter in the life of Gianna and Brandon. There's more to come, and we want you to be a part of it. The days that followed were heavy with an unspoken tension that lingered in the walls of the Brown estate. Even in the grandeur of the house, where every room was a picture of opulence, where marble floors gleamed under the light of an endless cloudless sky, something was wrong. The house felt as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something, or perhaps someone, to fill the space with life again. Gianna Martinez had been with the Smith family for months now, But in all that time, she had never quite felt like she belonged. She was part of the household support staff, a quiet presence that moved with care and precision, doing what was needed without ever drawing attention. She wasn't hired to soothe Sofia to become the child's protector, yet she found herself in that very role night after night. Brandon Smith, though, had made it clear from the beginning that his family didn't need her to interfere. She was there to stay out of the way, to keep to the shadows. And for the most part, Gianna did just that. She kept to her place, performed her duties, and never once allowed herself to feel anything more than a quiet observer to the life around her. But then there was Sofia. The child had become her quiet obsession, her only anchor in the stillness of the estate. It was a restless night when the cry first shattered the silence again. Gianna had just finished her shift. The house was still. The other staff had gone home, leaving only the hum of distant air conditioning and the faint echoes of footsteps that never quite seemed to fade. She was in her small quarters, reading through a book she had brought from the library. She didn't expect to hear it, the soft, desperate cry that would slip through the cracks of her carefully built walls. It was faint at first, a slight sound barely louder than a whisper. But Gianna knew that sound. She had heard it too many times before, in too many other places. The sound of a child in pain, a child who wasn't just calling for attention, but for connection, a child who needed to be heard. Her book fell to the floor as she stood up. The decision to go wasn't conscious. It was instinctive, driven by a knowing that lived deep within her, a knowing she couldn't ignore. She crept through the house, her sneakers making no sound against the cool marble floors. When she reached the nursery, the lights were dim, casting the room in a silver hue, the shadows growing long and soft. The automated skylight had been programmed to give the room a constant, gentle glow, but it felt colder than usual tonight. Sofia lay in her crib, kicking and squirming, her tiny face flushed with the distress that had become all too familiar in the weeks since her mother's death. The room was eerily silent, except for Sofia's cries, which had grown louder, more desperate, as if she were drowning in the emptiness surrounding her. Gianna moved closer, her heart aching for the little one, who didn't yet understand the world she had been born into. She reached down, her voice low and gentle, carrying the weight of all the unspoken things she had never shared with anyone. "Shh, Sofia," she whispered, brushing the child's damp forehead. "It's all right. I'm here." Sofia's cries quieted for a moment, as if the words themselves had been enough to calm her. But then, almost immediately, the distress returned, the sound growing in pitch. Gianna hesitated for only a second before gently lifting Sofia from the crib. She cradled the baby close to her chest, pressing the small, trembling body against her own, as if offering her warmth in a world that had so far been too cold. Her hand brushed through the soft curls on Sofia's head as she began to hum a smooth, quiet lullaby that Gianna had not sung in years, one she hadn't allowed herself to remember until now. It was a lullaby from her childhood long ago, when she had been nothing more than a scared little girl in a foster home. Her foster mother had sung it to her on nights when the outside world seemed too big and loud. It was a simple tune that carried the kind of warmth Gianna hadn't realized she had missed so desperately until that very moment. As her voice filled the quiet room, something shifted. The tension in Sofia's small body began to ease, her hands unclenching, her breathing slowing. Gianna's heart ached as she felt the child's body relax into her arms, the tiny face pressed against her chest in a quiet surrender. For a brief moment, the world outside the nursery ceased to exist. She wasn't sure how much time had passed. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. Only she and Sofia were in that space, and the soft rhythm of Gianna's lullaby was the only sound in the room. And then the door opened, with a force that broke the delicate peace they had found. "Put her down." The voice was sharp, cold, laced with anger, and something deeper, something Gianna couldn't name. Brandon Smith stood in the doorway, his tall figure framed by the light from the hallway. His eyes locked on her with an intensity that sent a chill through Gianna's bones. He took one step forward, his gaze never leaving her arms where Sofia rested calm now, no longer crying. Gianna froze. She could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on her, suffocating her in a way she had never felt before. I didn't mean to," Gianna stammered, her heart racing. She wouldn't stop crying. I said, "Put her down." Brandon repeated his tone, unwavering, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to getting what he wanted. Gianna's breath caught in her throat. Her hands, still holding Sofia, trembled slightly. She knew the coming words, the accusation hanging like a threat. He would never understand. He would never see what she saw. The brokenness in Sofia's cry, the loneliness that bled through the walls of this cold mansion. But even in the face of his anger, Gianna didn't back down. She didn't lower her gaze. She held Sofia tighter, pressing the baby against her chest, not as a defiance, but as a shield. She was just scared. Gianna said, her voice barely a whisper. The words filled with the kind of sorrow that only years of caring for others could bring. She's always scared. She needs someone to stay, someone who won't leave her alone. Brandon's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Gianna thought she might have said the wrong thing. But then something flickered in his gaze. Something raw. Something human. "Put her down," he repeated. But this time his voice had a hesitation. Gianna slowly, reluctantly lowered Sofia back into the crib. The baby whimpered slightly as she was placed on the soft mattress, the tiny hand reaching up for Gianna, as if to say goodbye. Sofia's eyes fluttered shut, her body still trembling with the remnants of her earlier distress. Brandon stepped forward, his hands stiff as he reached for his daughter. The moment Sofia left Gianna's arms, the baby stirred once more, her cries returning with a fierceness that sent a wave of guilt crashing through Gianna's chest. Gianna watched as Brandon awkwardly cradled Sofia, his movements mechanical, as if he were afraid to hurt her. He seemed so lost, so out of place in this role that had once been so familiar to his wife Emily. Sofia's cries grew louder, more desperate now that she was in her father's arms. Gianna stayed in the doorway for a moment longer, her heart aching as she watched the scene unfold. She didn't know how long she stood there, but when the last echo of Sofia's cries faded, she turned and left the room. The silence of the estate had returned, but this time it was heavier than before. As Gianna walked down the long, empty hallway, she couldn't help but think of how Sofia had looked at her, her eyes searching, pleading for something she couldn't explain. At that moment, Gianna realized that the child wasn't crying because of her. She was crying because Brandon couldn't see her. He couldn't see past the walls he had built around his heart, the walls he had put up long before Sofia's birth. But Gianna could see her. She could see the need in Sofia's eyes, the need for love, comfort, and warmth that had been absent for so long. And she would stay. She would stay for as long as it took because someone had to see her. Someone had to care. Even if it meant breaking the rules. Even if it meant defying Brandon. Gianna knew she would stay for Sofia, no matter what. The days after that night in the nursery passed with a tension that seemed to hang in the air, thick and unrelenting, like the heavy fog that often rolled in from the bay, blanketing the city in a suffocating silence. The brown estate, with its gleaming white columns and cold, polished floors, had become a house filled with unspoken things. Every hallway seemed longer, every room more distant, and each sound that echoed off the walls felt amplified, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything to break the stillness. Gianna moved through the house like a shadow, the silence around her wrapping itself like a cloak. She was still part of the household staff, still expected to keep to the background and serve without question. Yet after that night in the nursery, Something had shifted inside her. She had seen something in Brandon that went beyond the cold, distant businessman. It was brief, fleeting, but it had been there. She had seen it in how he looked at Sofia and how his hands trembled as he held his daughter. He was trying, but he didn't know how. Brandon was a man who had spent his life building empires and constructing bridges in the business world. But when it came to his family and heart, those bridges had never been built. He was lost adrift in a sea of responsibilities, overwhelmed by grief, and unable to find his way back to the things that truly mattered. Gianna had known men like him before, men who had forgotten what it meant to feel connect and truly see the people around them. But she had never felt as drawn to one as she did to Brandon. It was a quiet morning when she first saw him again, standing alone in the library, his hands resting on a stack of legal journals, his eyes distant. The usual calm of the estate had settled over the room, and for a moment, Gianna almost forgot the weight of the past days. The soft hum of the house, the sound of things settling into place, the faint ticking of a distant clock, was broken only by the faint rustle of pages as Brandon turned one slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. Gianna hesitated at the door, her hand resting on the doorknob. She wasn't sure why she had come in the first place. She wasn't scheduled to be there. She wasn't meant to interrupt. But something in her chest tugged at her that couldn't be ignored. "Mr. Smith," she said softly, stepping into the room. Despite its softness, her voice echoed in the quiet space, sharp against the stillness. Brandon looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. There was something in his gaze, something almost surprised. He hadn't expected her, hadn't anticipated her presence. He dropped the journal onto the desk with a quiet thud, his face shifting from concentration to something more guarded. "Gianna," he said, his voice low, his tone carefully neutral. There was no anger now, no coldness, just distance. But it wasn't the same kind of distance he had held before. It was something new, something uncertain. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, her voice laced with hesitation. Sofia." The mention of Sofia's name seemed to freeze the moment between them, and for a brief second, it felt like time had paused. Brandon's expression softened, his eyes darkening with something Gianna couldn't quite place. He stood up slowly, running a hand through his hair, as if the weight of the conversation had just dawned on him. "She's better," he said, finally, his voice quieter now, as though he were choosing his words carefully. "But I don't know what to do for her, Gianna." Gianna didn't respond immediately. She stood there watching him, her gaze steady, unblinking. She could see the cracks in his exterior and the vulnerability he was desperately trying to hide. He was fighting it, but it was there. She knew it. She had seen it before in others, in men who were too proud to ask for help, too proud to admit that they didn't have all the answers. "You don't have to do everything alone," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words came out before she could stop them, but they felt right. The truth of them rang clear in the quiet space between them. Brandon's eyes flickered, something like a flash of surprise passing across his features. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He seemed to be struggling with something he couldn't put into words, something that had been buried too deep for too long. Gianna stepped forward, closing the distance between them, her presence gentle but steady. She continued that she needs more than systems. Brandon continued, her voice unwavering. "She needs warmth. She needs someone who will stay." Brandon swallowed his throat, working as if the words were too heavy. He opened his mouth again, but he didn't speak this time. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, Gianna saw the weight of the grief that had been pressing down on him for so long. He was drowning, but he didn't know how to reach the surface. "I'm not good at this," he said finally, his voice thick with frustration. The words were raw, as if they had been trapped inside him for too long. "I don't know how to be a father. Not like Emily was." The name of his late wife, Emily, hung between them like an invisible thread, pulling at the fragile peace that had settled between them. Gianna could see the pain that came with that name, the memories that haunted him. She knew it wasn't just about being a father. It was about everything he had lost. "You don't have to be like her," Gianna said quietly. "You have to be here. That's all she needs." Brandon's eyes softened, his shoulders slumping, as though his grief had suddenly become too much to bear. He looked away momentarily, as if trying to compose himself, but Gianna could see the cracks in the facade he had so carefully built. "I don't know how to be that person," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to know everything," she replied, her voice steady, grounded. "You have to show up. That's the most challenging, but also the most essential part." There was silence between them for a moment, which felt different. It wasn't heavy with tension anymore. It wasn't filled with unspoken words or unacknowledged feelings. It was quiet, in the way that felt like an opening, like a possibility. Brandon exhaled slowly, his hand resting on the desk as he looked at Gianna. He said, "I don't know if I can do this," his voice thick with something she couldn't quite name. "You don't have to do it perfectly," she said, her words gentle but firm. "You have to keep trying." Brandon nodded, though the movement felt like more of a surrender than an agreement. He didn't know how to be the father Sofia needed. He didn't know how to be the man Gianna believed he could be. But he was willing to try for the first time in a long time. Gianna stayed with him for a moment longer, her presence solid, unwavering. There was something between them now, a thread delicate but strong. It was something she hadn't expected to find here in this cold, empty house. But it was there, pulling them together in a way neither could fully understand. "I'll help you," she said quietly, breaking the silence between them. "I'll stay for as long as you need me to." Brandon's eyes met hers again, without the walls he had always kept in place. There was something unspoken in his gaze, a question, a plea, a realization. He didn't say anything at first, but the quiet that passed between them was enough. "I don't deserve that," he said softly, the words heavy with regret. Gianna stepped back slightly, her eyes meeting his with a kind of clarity that had always been with her. "You don't have to deserve it. You have to accept it." And in that moment, something shifted. Brandon's world, which had once felt so rigid, so unyielding, began to crack. The walls he had built to keep out the pain, to keep himself safe, started to crumble piece by piece. And Gianna, she wasn't here to save him. She wasn't here to fix everything. She was here to stay. For Sofia, for Brandon, for herself. The weight of the past still hung in the air, but there was something lighter now, a sense of possibility, however small it may have been, and that Gianna realized was enough. Small changes, subtle shifts in the rhythm of the house marked the days that followed. With its grandeur, the Brown estate began to feel less like a museum and more like a home, though only just. The air had changed in some quiet, unseen way, softer somehow. Since that night, Gianna first soothed Sofia in the nursery. Yet even with the warmth that now lingered in the corners of the house, there was an underlying tension, something still unspoken hanging between her and Brandon, a fragile piece that neither of them knew how to navigate. Gianna had never been one for pretenses. She knew her place within the house staff, a necessary part of the machine, but always on the outside looking in. It had always been that way, not just in the Brown estate, but in every place she had ever worked. Yet it felt different in this house with Brandon and Sofia. She wasn't just a caretaker. She wasn't just a woman taking care of someone else's child. With every passing day, as she watched Brandon slowly begin to soften, she felt herself drawn closer to him, to the man hidden beneath the businessman, beneath the father, struggling with his grief. And though they had never spoken of it directly, there were moments fleeting but undeniable, when their eyes would meet across a room, and in that silence, there was an understanding. It was the kind of understanding that didn't need words. Brandon, too, had changed, though he was careful not to show it. He had always been a man of control, meticulous in everything he did and said. But the walls he had built around himself crumbled slowly, like the slow but steady erosion of stone. He had started to spend more time with Sofia, not as a distant figure looming over her crib, but as a father, the kind of father Gianna had always hoped he could be. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close. But it was real. And that to Gianna was enough. It was one of those rare mornings when the house was quiet, the air still, and the sunlight poured gently through the curtains, soft and golden. Gianna had just finished her early rounds checking on Sofia and making sure the house was in order when she found herself in the library, staring at the rows of books that lined the walls. She wasn't sure what had drawn her in. Perhaps the sense of calm that seemed to hang in the air when the house was still. Or maybe the curiosity growing inside her ever since she first walked into this home. She wasn't sure how long she had been standing there, her fingers brushing the spines of the books, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned slowly, her heart giving a slight flutter, at the sight of Brandon standing in the doorway, looking as if he had just stepped out of one of those corporate meetings that had once consumed his life. His eyes softened when he saw her, and for a brief moment, there was nothing but the two of them standing in the quiet of the library, caught in the same shared silence. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, his voice soft, almost tentative. "Just needed to get away from the office for a bit." Gianna smiled gently, a small, knowing smile. "You're not interrupting," she replied, her voice quiet. "I was looking." "Looking for what?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to decipher her thoughts. She hesitated, unsure how to explain the pull she had always felt toward the shelves of books, the rows of words that seemed to promise a world beyond the one she had known. "I don't know," she said, her gaze drifting to the shelves. "Sometimes when I'm here, it feels like everything around me is so planned, so controlled. And I need to remind myself that there's something else, something real." Brandon didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his hands loosely at his sides, his gaze steady on her. It was as though he were trying to read her and understand what she wasn't saying. "I understand," he said after a long pause. His voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "Everything here, everything in my life has always been about control. But I've never really felt like I had control of anything that mattered." Gianna glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice quiet, her curiosity piqued. Brandon took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to the floor, as if gathering his thoughts, trying to find the right words to say. "I've spent so much of my life building this empire, this life. But when Emily died and Sofia came into my life, it all fell apart. Nothing made sense anymore. I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to fix her, or even myself." Gianna's heart softened at his words, and she stepped closer to him. The distance between them had always felt like an unbridgeable gap, but now in this moment, it didn't seem so wide. "You're not alone in this," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything they hadn't yet said to each other. "Sofia doesn't need you to fix her, Brandon. She needs you to be there. She needs you to be present. That's enough." Brandon's gaze met hers again, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that he had kept hidden for so long: vulnerability. It was a fleeting look, a brief crack in the armor he had built, but it was there. Gianna could see it. She could feel how he looked at her, as if he were reaching out for something he didn't know how to ask for. He said quietly that I don't know how to be the father she needs. I don't know how to be the man you think I can be. Gianna took another step closer, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. You don't have to know how, Brandon. You have to start. For a moment, the world outside the library seemed to fade away. It was just them standing in the quiet room, with the weight of everything they hadn't yet said between them. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for promises. All that mattered was that at that moment, they understood each other in a way they hadn't before. Brandon closed his eyes briefly, his face a mask of exhaustion, but something lighter. When he opened them again, he looked at Gianna with a quiet gratitude. You're right, he said softly. I don't have to have all the answers. I have to try. Gianna nodded, her gaze steady on him. That's all any of us can do. The tension between them wasn't gone, but it had shifted. It was no longer a wall, a barrier that kept them from connecting. It was a bridge, fragile, yes, but honest. And in that quiet moment, Gianna realized something she hadn't fully understood. She wasn't just staying for Sofia anymore. She was waiting for Brandon too. And for the first time since she had walked into this house, she no longer felt like an outsider. Gianna stepped back, giving him a small, soft smile. I'll be in the nursery checking on Sofia. She's probably going to need her afternoon nap soon. Brandon nodded, his expression softening as he watched her leave. He didn't speak, but his eyes followed her as she walked toward the door, as though he saw her for the first time in a new light. She wasn't just the woman who cared for his daughter. She wasn't just the staff. She was something more. He didn't know precisely what that something was yet, but he somehow knew that he didn't want to lose it. As Gianna walked down the hallway toward Sofia's nursery, she felt the weight of the moment settle inside her, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt like the beginning of something new, an unspoken but understood promise. For the first time in this house, that had once felt so empty, so cold, Gianna felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The air had shifted. That much was undeniable. In the weeks that followed their conversation in the library, a quiet intimacy had grown between Gianna and Brandon. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance, a soft smile exchanged when Sofia had settled into sleep, or the briefest of touches when they crossed paths in the hallway. It wasn't the kind of intimacy that demanded recognition, but it was there. They didn't need words for it. Not yet. Gianna had found herself staying later into the evenings, her role in the house increasingly tied to something more profound than mere responsibility. She had started to enjoy the moments when the house was quiet, when the clinking of silverware and the shuffle of staff had faded, and it was just her, Brandon, and Sofia all together in a room caught in the soft, unspoken dance of healing. Brandon, for all his stoic demeanor, had begun to trust her, though neither would ever admit it aloud. Sofia, too, had become a different child. The restlessness that had once consumed her in the house's silence had slowly faded. The cries that used to echo through the night were becoming rarer, and in their place there was laughter, small tentative giggles as she played on the plush rugs of the nursery, her tiny hands reaching out for the comfort of Gianna's embrace. But as peaceful as the days seemed, there was always an undercurrent of change, a sense that something was waiting to break the fragile calm they had built. Gianna could feel it in the air, just as she had felt the shift between herself and Brandon. There was something else looming that neither of them had accounted for, and that something came in the form of a familiar voice. It was early one afternoon when Gianna first heard the sound of heels clicking across the marble floors. The echo was sharp, deliberate, too confident, too theatrical to belong to anyone passing by. Gianna paused mid-step in the kitchen, her heart suddenly quickening. She knew that sound, knew it all too well. Claire Monroe. The name hit Gianna like a punch to the gut, a name she had hoped never to hear again. Claire was Brandon's late wife's sister, and her return to the estate felt like an intrusion, a crack in the delicate peace they had all been trying to build. Gianna hadn't seen Claire in years, not since the funeral, not since the tumultuous time that had followed Emily's death. Claire had never been one to shy away from drama, and she certainly hadn't been one to shy away from trying to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. Gianna turned toward the door just as Claire entered the kitchen, her presence filling the room instantly. Claire's hair still as fiery red as it had always been, cascaded around her shoulders in perfect waves, her makeup flawless, her posture stiff with the same practiced poise that Gianna remembered all too well. "Well, well," Claire said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she surveyed the room. Her gaze landed on Gianna, sharp and calculating. "I see things have changed around here." Gianna stood still, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't flinch, didn't allow herself to show any sign of the unease that had settled like a heavy weight in her stomach. Claire had always had a way of making her feel small, of reminding her that she didn't quite belong. "What are you doing here?" Gianna asked, her voice steady, though the words felt foreign on her tongue. She hadn't expected Claire to return, certainly not without any warning. Claire's lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm here to see my niece," she replied smoothly. "I'm sure she's grown since I last saw her." Gianna's gaze narrowed, her body instinctively tensing at the mention of Sofia. Gianna said quietly, "She's not your niece," the words slipping out before she could stop them. "She's Brandon's daughter." Claire's eyes flickered with annoyance, but she quickly masked it, returning her attention to the room. "Still, I have a right to see her. She's family." Gianna held her ground, unwilling to let Claire's presence unsettle her. She wouldn't let this woman, this stranger, waltz back into their lives, as if she had every right to be there. Sofia, who had been playing quietly in the nursery, suddenly let out a small cry. Gianna's heart clenched at the sound. She excused herself quickly, moving toward the door to check on the child. Claire didn't follow, but her gaze lingered on Gianna's retreating figure. When Gianna entered the nursery, she found Sofia sitting up in her crib, her small hands reaching toward her, her face scrunched with distress. She quickly scooped the child into her arms, holding her close as Sofia's cries slowly subsided. The sound of the door opening behind her didn't surprise her. She had known Brandon would follow. "What's going on?" Brandon's voice, though calm, held an edge of concern. He stood in the doorway, his eyes searching for answers in Gianna's face. Gianna turned to him, her expression guarded. "Claire's here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Brandon's face tightened, and for a brief moment, Gianna saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It was frustration, perhaps, or guilt. She couldn't quite tell. But whatever it was, it quickly passed, replaced by the calm composure he wore so often. "She's here," he asked, his voice low. "I didn't know she was coming." Gianna replied that she didn't tell anyone, her arms tightening around Sofia. "She just showed up." Brandon exhaled slowly, stepping further into the room. "I should have known," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "She's never been one to stay away for long." Gianna looked down at Sofia, her small form still nestled in her arms, her tiny fingers grasping at the fabric of Gianna's shirt. The baby had calmed again, her breath slow and even as she rested against Gianna's chest. But Gianna couldn't shake the feeling that the peace they had worked so hard to create was about to be shattered. I don't trust her, Gianna said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She doesn't care about Sofia. She never did. Brandon looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Finally, he nodded slowly. I know, but she's still family, and I don't want to fight with her. Gianna's heart twisted at his words. Family. Was that what this was? Was that what Brandon thought he owed Claire? Someone who had never been there for him for Sofia. Someone who had disappeared when they had needed her most. She'll hurt her, Gianna said quietly, her voice tinged with the rawness of truth. I can feel it. Sofia trusts you, Brandon. She trusts me, but not her. Brandon's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Gianna thought he might say anything to counter her. But he didn't. Instead, he reached out gently, taking Sofia from her arms, his hands steady as he cradled the baby against his chest. I'll talk to her, he said quietly, but I won't let her hurt Sofia. I promise. Gianna didn't respond immediately, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than she intended. His eyes had a softness, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. He was trying, and maybe that was all they could ask for. When they returned to the kitchen, Claire stood by the window, her back to them, a smug smile playing on her lips, as if she had already won something. Her gaze flickered to Brandon as he entered, and her smile widened. Well, she said, turning to face him. The little family is doing quite well. But I'm afraid things aren't as perfect as they seem, are they? Brandon didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked toward the counter, placing Sofia gently into her high chair. He turned to face his sister-in-law, his expression neutral, though Gianna could see the tension building beneath the surface. What do you want, Claire? He asked, his voice low but firm. Claire's smile never wavered. I want what's mine, she said. I want to be a part of Sofia's life, and if that means stepping in, then so be it. Brandon took a deep breath, his fists clenched at his sides. He was trying so hard to keep control, to keep the situation from spiraling out of hand, but Gianna could see the crack in his facade. You don't get to walk back in here and act like nothing's changed, he said, his voice steady despite the tension in his body. Sofia is my daughter, not yours. Claire's eyes darkened, her lips curling into a bitter smile. We'll see about that, she said coldly. You may think you have control, Brandon, but in the end, blood always wins. The words hit Gianna like a slap. She could feel the walls closing in around them, and the weight of Claire's presence pressing down on the fragile peace they had worked so hard to build. But this time, Gianna wasn't going to let it happen. She stepped forward, her gaze steady on Claire. Sofia isn't a pawn, she said firmly, and neither is Brandon. Claire turned to face her, her eyes narrowing with disdain. And you are? She asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Gianna didn't flinch. I'm the one who stayed, she said quietly. I'm the one who will always remain. Claire didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the kitchen, her footsteps echoing in the hallway like a threat. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. But for the first time in a long while, Gianna didn't feel afraid. She didn't feel alone. Because in this house, in this moment, they had each other. And that Gianna realized was enough. The storm that Claire had brought into the estate didn't vanish with her footsteps. Even after she left, her presence lingered in the air, like the faint trace of perfume that refused to dissipate. The Brown estate once again was unsettled. The walls carried an echo, and the people inside them seemed to breathe a little differently. Brandon had tension in his shoulders and the sharpness of his voice when he gave instructions to staff, and in the way he seemed unable to sit still for long. Sofia sensed it too, her laughter quieter, her eyes searching more often for the familiar comfort of Gianna's arms. Gianna herself tried to keep calm and create a rhythm that would reassure the child. She hummed lullabies more often, sat longer by the crib at night, and spoke softly in the nursery, as though her words could create a shield. Yet in the stillness when she was alone, she felt the weight of something else pressing in, something from her past that she hadn't confronted in years. It came in the form of a name, Elijah. She hadn't spoken it aloud in nearly a decade. But one evening, as the sun dipped behind the rolling hills and painted the estate in bruised gold, she heard it again. Gianna. The voice was hesitant, rough around the edges worn by years that hadn't been kind. She froze in the garden, her hands still on the watering can she had carried to the lavender pots. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she turned. He stood there by the iron gate. His frame was leaner than she remembered, his eyes more hollow, but the outline of his face, the jaw she had once traced with her fingertips, the curve of his smile she had once believed in, was unmistakable. Elijah. Her breath caught in her chest. Memories rushed in uninvited. Nights spent whispering secrets under broken street lamps. His hands were warm against hers when she thought the world had abandoned her. And then the betrayal. The money is gone from her bag. The locked door behind him. The eviction notice was taped to her window the next morning. The silence that followed for years. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended, though her hands trembled at her sides. He looked down briefly, his shoulders tense before meeting her gaze again. "I didn't come to disrupt anything. I saw you. On television. The interview. With the Harbor Project." His lips curved faintly, but there was no light in his expression. "I didn't believe it at first. You looked whole, strong. I had to see for myself." Gianna clenched her jaw, trying to steady herself against the emotions inside her. "You shouldn't have come." "I know," Elijah admitted quickly, his voice breaking slightly. "I know I don't deserve to stand here. But I'm clean, Gianna. 5 years. I run a pantry in Oakland now. We help people. People like us. People who don't have anything. I thought—" He stopped, inhaling sharply. "I could help you now. Somehow." The irony struck her bitter and sharp. Years ago she had needed him and someone to stand by her when the world was collapsing. And he had left. Now, when she had built something of her own and found a fragile peace within herself and this house, he returned, offering what she no longer asked for. Gianna's voice was steady, though her chest ached. "You didn't check on me when I wasn't okay. You didn't come back when I had nothing. You chose yourself, Elijah. And you left me to drown." His eyes closed briefly, as though the words had struck him like a physical blow. "I was broken," he whispered. "So was I," she replied, the quiet finality in her tone sharper than any raised voice. They stood silently, separated by more than the iron gate between them. For a moment, Gianna thought he might turn and leave, and vanish again into the night like before. But instead he pulled something from his jacket, a thin folder worn at the edges. "This isn't for me," he said, holding it out. "It's for you, for Harbor, for the people you're trying to reach. Inside are letters, testimonials from the people at the pantry, women who rebuilt their lives, men fresh from rehab, kids who needed a safe place. I thought maybe you'd know what to do with them." Gianna stared at the folder, at the man holding it. Her instinct was to refuse to shut the door on this part of her life that had haunted her for so long. But her hands betrayed her. Slowly she reached forward, taking the folder. Their fingers brushed for an instant, and the contact felt like a reminder of a life she no longer lived. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quiet. "But this doesn't change anything between us." "I know," Elijah replied. His voice was low, resigned. I don't want to take anything from you. I just wanted to give something back for once. He stepped back, his hands sliding into his pockets, his gaze steady on her. I'm sorry, Gianna, for everything. Then he turned, walking away down the long road that led out of Bel Air, his figure growing smaller until the shadows swallowed him. Gianna stood there for a long time, the folder pressed against her chest, the weight of memories heavy on her shoulders. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried for Elijah in years, but her heart ached with the reminder that some scars never fade, no matter how much healing you've done. That night, she sat in her room, the folder open. She read each letter carefully, eyes scanning the words of people with the same pain she once carried. Each story was raw, heavy with loss, but also threaded with resilience. They spoke of broken homes, empty cupboards, and nights on the streets. And in each was a note of hope, thin, fragile, but undeniable. When she closed the folder, she felt something loosen inside her. Maybe Elijah hadn't changed who he was to her. The past could never be rewritten, but his effort, his reaching back towards something good, mattered in its own way, and that was enough. Later that evening, Brandon found her in the study, the folder still in her lap. He stopped at the doorway, his gaze lingering on her face, the exhaustion in her eyes. Someone from my past came by today, she said softly, not looking up. Brandon stepped closer, his voice calm but taut. Do I know the name Elijah? He stiffened. She didn't need to look at him to feel the tension radiating off his frame. He's not a threat, she added quickly. He's not here for that. He just wanted to show me he's changed. And you believe him? Brandon asked, his voice low, careful. Gianna looked up at him, finally her gaze steady. I don't know if I do, but it doesn't matter. What matters is what I choose to do with what he gave me. She lifted the folder slightly. These letters, they're real. They could help us. Help Harbor. Brandon's jaw tightened, but his eyes softened as they settled on her. I don't want you hurt, he said quietly. I'm not that easy to break anymore, Gianna replied, her voice firm, though something in her chest ached at his protectiveness. Brandon stepped closer, his hand brushing hers as he reached for the folder. His fingers lingered warm against her skin. I know you're strong, he said, his voice softer now. But I'm still afraid. Not for Harbor. For you. Their eyes met, and the room seemed to shrink momentarily, leaving only the two of them and the unspoken truth in the air. Brandon's hand didn't move. His touch was steady and grounding. Gianna swallowed, her voice barely audible. You don't have to be. But even as she said it, she realized part of her wanted him to be. Part of her wished someone to fear for her, to care enough to stand guard even when she believed she could stand alone. That night, when she finally lay in bed, Gianna didn't dream of Elijah. She didn't dream of the past of betrayals or broken promises. She dreamed of Sofia's laughter echoing through the halls, of Brandon standing at her side, his hand steady on hers, as if anchoring her to a future she hadn't dared imagine. And when she woke, she realized that the storm of her past hadn't shattered her. It had only made her stronger. The ghosts of Elijah and everything he represented would always linger, but they no longer defined her. Because now in this house that had once felt so cold, she had found something new, something worth staying for, something worth protecting. And in the fragile silence of dawn, Gianna knew she wasn't running anymore. The estate had returned to a semblance of calm, but the kind of calm carried tension beneath the surface, like the deceptive stillness of water just before a storm. Gianna felt it every time she passed Brandon in the hall, their eyes brushing against each other, heavy with words unsaid. She felt it in the way Sofia clung to her at night, as though her small hands knew instinctively that the world around her was fragile, waiting to crack. And then the crack came. Not in the way anyone expected, not through Claire's venom or Elijah's shadow, but through something far colder, far more calculated. It was early morning when the first message arrived. Gianna was in the nursery, rocking Sofia gently, when her phone buzzed with a series of frantic alerts. At first, she ignored them, too absorbed in the rise and fall of the child's breathing, the quiet hum of her lullaby filling the room. But the buzzing didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until she finally reached for the device. The first words made her blood run cold. Ezra, lead engineer, harbor urgent. Data failure. We're losing user profiles, potential breach. Her heart stumbled in her chest. She read the message twice, then again, as though repetition might change the meaning. It didn't. The words were stark, brutal. Data failure. Breach. The team was unraveling when she reached Harbor's downtown office. Engineers crowded around their laptops, eyes wide, voices frantic. The whiteboard in the center of the room was covered with hastily drawn diagrams, arrows, pointing at errors that seemed to multiply with every minute. Ezra met her at the door, his face pale, his voice strained. "It's not just onboarding," he said quickly. "It's journaling too. Clients are logging in to find their entire progress wiped. Weeks, months gone. We think it's a failed integration between the journaling API and the legacy servers, but..." He hesitated, glancing at the floor before meeting her eyes. "There's a chance this isn't accidental." Gianna froze, her pulse quickening. Sabotage. Ezra nodded reluctantly. "We won't know until the logs finish, but the timing, the structure, it doesn't feel like a mistake." The room spun around her. Harbor wasn't just code. It wasn't just an app. It was the lifeline for so many who had trusted them, trusted her. Every letter, every message from women and men who had found comfort in Harbor flashed through her mind like shards of broken glass. To fail them now felt unthinkable. She drew in a breath, forcing the panic down. "First, we stabilize," she said, her voice steady despite the fire raging inside her. "Restore what we can. Communicate openly. We don't hide this." The team nodded, relief flickering across their faces as her calm began to anchor them. Gianna moved from desk to desk, leaning over shoulders, offering reassurance, redirecting the frantic energy into focused action. But inside, every step felt like walking across a breaking bridge. By noon, the headlines had begun. Small blogs at first, then louder voices. Screenshots of lost progress spread across social media. Hashtags blooming like wildfire. How safe is Harbor? Is emotional data too fragile to trust? In the middle of the storm, her phone buzzed again. This time it was Brandon. "Brandon, I saw the reports. Where are you?" She didn't answer right away. She couldn't. The weight of responsibility pressed too heavily on her chest. Instead, she turned back to the team, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "We built Harbor because we believed people deserved safety. That doesn't vanish because of one fracture. We will fix this. We will show up, and we'll come out stronger, or we won't come out." The room stilled, heads lifted. For a heartbeat, the panic eased, replaced by something steadier, clearer. Hope. Hours later, when the sun had already dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of violet, Brandon arrived at the office. He didn't come as the CEO, not as the billionaire whose name opened doors and bent rules. He came as a man searching for the woman who had become the anchor of his fractured world. He found her outside, standing beneath the narrow awning of the building, the rain beginning to fall in light sheets. Her blouse was wrinkled, her braid half undone, her shoulders taut with exhaustion. She didn't notice him at first, too lost in her thoughts, too consumed by the storm inside. "You didn't have to come," she said softly when she finally turned, her voice raw, her eyes tired. "I wanted to," Brandon replied. His gaze lingered on her face, the fire still burning in her despite the storm. "I saw the coverage. How bad is it?" She exhaled, the sound heavy. "Bad. They're already questioning if I should be here at all. Suppose this proves that emotions don't belong in business, that I don't belong in business." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, blinking hard against the weight pressing behind her eyes. "I don't want to fail them, Brandon. I can't." He stepped closer, his hand lifting almost instinctively, his fingers brushing her jaw with a tenderness that startled them both. "You haven't failed," he said, his voice low, sure. "You've already changed the world, Gianna. You're just learning what happens when the world tries to push back." Her breath caught the truth of his words, striking deep. She closed her eyes for a moment, leaning into the warmth of his hand despite herself. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the awning, but neither moved. "Do you want to rest?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his with a fierce determination. "Not yet." And then, before she could think and stop herself, she leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't soft. It wasn't tentative. It was a kiss born from fire, fear, and everything they hadn't dared to speak. Her lips pressed against his with a desperation that surprised her, her hands trembling slightly as they clutched at the fabric of his shirt. For a heartbeat, he stilled, stunned. And then he kissed her back with the certainty of a man who had been waiting far too long. His hand slid into her hair, his other arm anchoring her against him, as though he could shield her from every storm. The rain poured down harder, a curtain of sound that blurred the rest of the world into nothing. For that moment, there was no harbor crisis, no headlines, no ghosts of the past. Only the two of them collided in a way that felt inevitable. When they finally pulled apart, breathless Gianna searched his eyes, her chest heaving. "Brandon." He pressed his forehead against hers, his voice rough. I know. Ezra's voice cut through the storm from the doorway. "We found it," he said quickly. It was sabotage, a dormant line of code from one of the contractors, triggered by the last update. Brandon's jaw tightened, but Gianna only closed her eyes briefly, relief and fury tangling inside her. At least it wasn't her failure. At least it wasn't Harbor's foundation that was flawed. But the betrayal stung just the same. That night, after the team confirmed the path to restoration, Gianna posted a video statement. No filters, no script. Just her sitting on a bench outside the office, the city lights flickering behind her. Her voice was steady, though her eyes shimmered with the weight of truth. "Today, some of you lost pieces of yourselves inside Harbor. Not because we didn't care, but because someone tried to erase what we've built. We are restoring every file and every profile. But more than that, we are showing up. Because healing is not flawless. But you matter, even when it breaks. Especially then." The video spread quickly. Thousands of comments poured in. Some angry, yes. Some skeptical. But many more were filled with gratitude, forgiveness, and promises to stay. In the quiet that followed, Brandon watched the video alone in his study. He watched it twice, then a third time, each viewing leaving his chest heavier with something he could no longer deny. Later, when he finally came to bed, he found Gianna asleep. Sofia was curled against her, her tiny hand resting on Gianna's shoulder, as though she belonged there. And maybe she did. Brandon stood in the doorway for a long time, his heart caught in his throat. Then, quietly, afraid to break the spell, he whispered into the stillness, "I love you, Gianna didn't stir, but in her sleep, she smiled, as though she had been waiting all her life to hear those words even in a dream. The storm outside had passed, but inside the Brown estate, the air was still trembling with the aftermath of everything that had unfolded. The sabotage, the headlines, the kiss in the rain. It was as if the house itself had absorbed all of it, holding each secret, each fragile truth. Gianna crept through the halls that morning, her hair still damp from the night before, her body heavy with exhaustion. She hadn't slept much. After the crisis at Harbor had begun to stabilize, she'd returned to the estate, checked on Sofia, and tried to rest. But her thoughts had been too loud. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the press of Brandon's lips against hers, the warmth of his hands anchoring her in the downpour, the whisper of his voice echoing in her chest. "I love you." He hadn't said it directly to her, not in a way that demanded acknowledgement, but she had felt it. She had dreamed it. And it was enough to leave her heart caught in a delicate balance between fear and hope. When she entered the kitchen, she found him already there, leaning against the counter with a mug of black coffee in his hand. His tie hung loosely around his neck, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his hair slightly tousled, as though he hadn't given himself time to tame it. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment, the world stilled. Neither spoke immediately. The silence stretched, but it wasn't the brittle kind that had once filled the space between them. It was weighted thick with everything unspoken. Finally, Brandon set his mug down and straightened. His eyes never left hers. "You should be resting." "I tried," Gianna said softly, moving toward the kettle. She busied herself making tea, though her hands trembled slightly as they touched the porcelain cup. It didn't work. He studied her for a moment, his gaze searching as though trying to read all the words she hadn't said. Then, with a quiet sigh, he stepped closer. The distance between them shrank until she could feel the faint warmth of his body beside her. "I meant what I said," he murmured, his voice low. Her hands stilled the kettle, hovering just above the cup. Slowly, she looked up at him, her dark eyes wide. "Last night?" He nodded, all of it. "Gianna, I'm not the kind of man who says things he doesn't mean. I never have been." Her chest tightened, her breath catching, as she searched his face for any hint of hesitation. But there was none. His blue eyes were clear, unwavering, like a promise he had held inside for far too long. "Brandon." Her voice faltered softer now. She set the kettle down, her fingers curling against the counter to steady herself. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." "I'm not asking for ready," he said gently. "I'm asking for honesty." Her gaze dropped, her lashes brushing against her cheeks, as she tried to gather the storm of feelings inside her. For so long she had built her life on survival, moving from one moment to the next, without allowing herself the luxury of wanting more. Wanting meant risk, and risk meant loss. But here with him, everything was shifting. She lifted her eyes again, and they didn't waver this time. "I don't know what I can give you. I don't know what I have left." Brandon reached out, then, his fingers brushing against hers on the counter, the contact deliberate but tender. "You've already given me more than you realize." Her throat tightened. What if it's not enough? His hand covered hers fully now, his grip steady, grounding. "Then I'll take what you can give, and be grateful for it. Because, Gianna, it's you. It's only ever been you." The words hit her like a wave, breaking through the last of her resistance. Her heart ached with their weight, with the realization that this man, the billionaire with the fortress-like walls around his soul, was laying himself bare for her. Before she could respond, Sofia's soft babble drifted into the kitchen. Both turned toward the sound. The little girl was sitting in her high chair, her curls wild from sleep, her small hands clapping as if she had been watching them all along. Gianna laughed softly, the tension easing as she moved toward the child. She lifted Sofia gently, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You always know when to interrupt, don't you?" she whispered. Brandon watched them, his expression softening into something that made Gianna's heart flutter. It was the look of a man who had found something he hadn't known he'd been searching for all his life. Later that afternoon, the three of them found themselves in the garden. The rain had left the earth damp, the air cool and fresh, with the scent of soil and roses. Sofia toddled across the grass, her small legs unsteady, but determined, while Gianna trailed behind, ready to catch her if she stumbled. Brandon stood a few steps away, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the scene before him. Gianna bent down her laughter light as she encouraged Sofia toward her, and the sound struck him like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He had heard her laugh before, but never like this, never so free, so unguarded. "You should laugh more," he said quietly when she straightened her eyes, meeting his. She tilted her head, her brows lifting slightly. "And why's that?" "Because it makes the world quieter," he replied. Her lips parted, surprise flickering across her face at the unexpected softness in his words. For a moment, she forgot the dampness of the ground, the chill of the breeze. All she could feel was the warmth of his gaze, the pull between them that grew stronger with every shared moment. That evening, after Sofia had fallen asleep with her stuffed elephant tucked in her arms, Gianna returned to the terrace. The sky was painted with fading streaks of orange and violet, the last traces of daylight surrendering to night. She leaned against the railing, her tea cradled in her hands, her thoughts swirling. She didn't hear Brandon approach, but she felt him. He stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched his. Silence, steady, not intrusive. They both looked out at the horizon for a while, saying nothing. Finally, he spoke. "Do you believe people can change?" Gianna glanced at him. Her brow furrowed slightly. "Some people," she said slowly. "The ones who remember who they were before the world told them to forget." He nodded, his eyes distant. "And who were you, Gianna?" Her chest tightened, the question pulling at a part of her she rarely let anyone see. She hesitated, then answered softly. "A girl who wanted to feel safe." His gaze shifted to her, then sharp and unflinching. "Do you feel safe here?" She swallowed, her throat dry, but her eyes didn't waver. "I feel seen." The words hung between them heavier than any confession she had ever made. For Brandon, they landed with a force he hadn't expected. To be seen for him, it had always been about power, reputation, and visibility. But for Gianna, it was something deeper, something more human. At that moment, he realized she had given him more than trust. She had given him the truth of herself. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers, tentative at first, as though testing the space between them. When she didn't pull away, he laced his fingers with hers, quiet but confident. They stood that way for a long time, the night settling around them, the stars beginning to flicker above. The world was still holding its breath, as though bearing witness to something fragile and new. And in the silence, Gianna let herself lean just slightly into him. Not forward, not backward, but inward, towards something that felt dangerously close to love. By the time dawn stretched across the hills of Bel Air the next morning, nothing had been spoken outright. Yet everything had changed. Their rhythm was different now, gentler, closer, no longer burdened by walls of denial. Brandon still carried his grief, and Gianna still held her scars. But in the spaces between their words, something unshakable had begun to take root. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. And for both of them, that was enough. The Brown estate had grown warmer in recent weeks. Not in temperature, but in the way air shifted when footsteps echoed, in the way laughter seemed to linger just a little longer than before. Sofia's giggles filled the nursery almost every morning, and when the house fell quiet at night, it was no longer the silence of emptiness, but of rest. For Gianna, each day felt like stepping into a fragile new world where she belonged not because of obligation, but because of choice. She found herself in a rhythm she had never imagined: mornings spent with Sofia, afternoons working on Harbor's rebuilding strategy, evenings, sometimes shared with Brandon in companionable quiet. They didn't speak often of what had passed between them. The kiss in the rain, the hand held on the terrace, but neither pretended it hadn't happened. It lingered alive, breathing in every glance, every brush of skin, every pause in their conversations. Yet love, Gianna knew, was never safe. It was tender, dangerous, always balanced on the edge of fear. And fear had a way of creeping back in when least expected. The first ripple came from outside. The Harbor crisis had stabilized, but the board was restless. Brandon returned from meetings in the city with shadows under his eyes, his shoulders rigid, his voice sharper than usual when he spoke to his assistants. One evening, Gianna found him in the study, pacing in front of the tall windows, his phone pressed to his ear. "No, Franklin," he said tightly. "Replacing her isn't an option. Harbor exists because of her. Without Gianna, there is no heart in this project." Gianna froze in the doorway. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Brandon's jaw clenched. "If the board can't see that, then they're blind. And I won't bend to optics over substance." He hung up with a sharp exhale, pressing his fingers against his temples. Only then did he notice her. "How long were you standing there?" His voice was softer now, though the tension still lingered. "Long enough," she said carefully, stepping into the room. "They want me gone, don't they?" His eyes darkened. "They're cowards. They want someone polished, someone with a pedigree that looks good on press releases." Gianna's chest tightened. She had expected it in some distant part of her mind. The world had constantly reminded her she wasn't polished, seamless, or safe enough to be the face of something so significant. But hearing it now from his lips was different. "And you," she said quietly. "What do you want?" Brandon moved closer, his gaze locking onto hers with a force that made her breath catch. "I want the woman who made my daughter laugh for the first time in months. I want the woman who stood in front of a room full of doubters and spoke truth until they had no choice but to listen. I want you." Her heart thudded painfully. He said it with such certainty that for a moment she almost believed the boardroom battles didn't matter. Almost. But fear whispered in her mind. What if they win? What if the world decides I'm insufficient and Brandon chooses them over me? The second ripple came from within. Claire had disappeared after her dramatic confrontation, but her absence was not peace. It was a shadow waiting at the edge of their lives. Brandon never spoke of her yet. Gianna caught how his expression hardened whenever Sofia's custody papers were mentioned. She knew he feared Claire would resurface with lawyers and leverage, but the silence was worse for now. During one of these quiet days, Gianna noticed Brandon watching her differently, not with the guarded intensity he once carried, but with something more searching. They were in the nursery. Sofia had fallen asleep against Gianna's chest, her small hand curled in Gianna's shirt. Brandon stood in the doorway, his posture softening as he watched them. "You look like she belongs to you," he murmured. Gianna glanced up, startled. "She doesn't. She's yours." "Yes," he said, stepping closer, his gaze steady. "But she also reaches for you before anyone else. She sleeps when you're near. She smiles differently with you. That's not just mine, Gianna. That's yours too." Her throat tightened, words caught somewhere between gratitude and fear. Because she wanted it too much. And wanting meant risking heartbreak if it was ever taken away. Brandon reached out, brushing a curl from Sofia's forehead, before his fingers lingered near Gianna's hand. She believes you're hers. And maybe she's right. Gianna lowered her gaze, unable to hold his intensity. Please don't say that unless you mean it. I do. His voice was steady, quiet, but firm, as though it were the only truth he could cling to. The silence stretched thick with meaning. The third ripple was Gianna herself. That night, when the house was quiet, she sat awake in her room, staring at the folder Elijah had given her. She had promised herself she wouldn't think of him anymore. That part of her life was done. But the letters inside, voices of people who reminded her of the girl she used to be, pulled at her. Do you belong here? The voices seemed to ask. Or do you still belong to us? To the broken, the unseen, the forgotten. The next morning, Brandon found her in the garden with dark circles beneath her eyes. You didn't sleep, he said softly, his brow furrowing. I kept thinking about Harbor, about the people it's supposed to serve. She looked up at him, her voice unsteady. And whether I'm betraying them by being here, by letting myself want this, want you. His jaw tightened, his eyes searching hers. Gianna, you don't understand. Her voice cracked, now trembling. I've spent my whole life surviving Brandon. Surviving meant never letting myself need anyone or rest in someone's arms. And now I'm here, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to hold both, Harbor, Sofia, you, and not lose myself again. He stepped forward, cupping her face, forcing her to meet his gaze. Listen to me. You're not betraying anyone. You're building something new. With Harbor, with Sofia, with me. And I won't let you lose yourself in the process. I won't let you. Her breath shuddered out his certainty, pressing against her doubts. Slowly, she leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. For a moment the fear eased. But even as she let herself rest against him, a voice whispered inside her, peace like this never lasts. It didn't. The fracture came 2 weeks later. The media storm had calmed, the board had quieted, and Harbor was preparing its relaunch. On the surface, everything looked brighter. Yet Gianna knew better than to trust the surface. The article dropped without warning. Headlined across the morning news. From shelters to startups. The tragic backstory behind Harbor's emotional lead. Her photograph, stolen from a speaking event, stared back at her. The article dug through her foster care records, quoted former caseworkers, and pieced together fragments of her life she had never shared willingly. Words like abandoned, unstable, and transient were plastered in bold print, painted as though they defined her entirely. By the time she finished reading, her hands were trembling. Brandon found her on the terrace, the tablet abandoned beside her, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Gianna, he said, his voice low with fury. I'll fix this. I'll bury them. But she shook her head, her voice hollow. You can't bury what's true. It's twisted, he shot back, kneeling before her. It's painted in pity instead of strength. You are not their narrative. Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. Maybe I am. I've been pretending I could rewrite it. He reached for her hands, gripping them tightly. You already have. Every day you stay here, every time you breathe life into Harbor, every moment you hold Sofia, you are rewriting it. Not for them, for you. Her heart cracked open at his words. The fear still heavy, but softened by how he looked at her, as though she wasn't broken glass, but the light shining through it. Yet deep down, Gianna knew the world would not stop questioning her. The world would always ask if she was enough. And the most challenging part was not answering the world. She was answering herself. The morning after the article, the estate was quieter than usual. The quiet was not peace, but a pause. the hush that came when the world outside had grown too loud, and those within were waiting to see what would break next. Gianna stood at the upstairs hall window, her arms folded across her chest. Outside, Bel Air basked in its golden light, as if the sun had no care for headlines, pitying words, or the sting of judgment. The city still pulsed, traffic hummed, and yet her world felt as though it were balanced precariously on the edge of something she couldn't quite name. Behind her, small footsteps echoed Sofia, toddling down the hall, her plush elephant dragging along the floor. She looked up, her big eyes bright, her smile as unshaken as the sun. "Nana," she called, her voice stumbling over the consonants. Gianna's chest softened. She bent to scoop the child into her arms, pressing her lips to Sofia's forehead. In that small embrace, the noise of the world dimmed. Perhaps this was what safety felt like, not silence, but the warmth of belonging, the reminder that someone wanted you near. But when Brandon appeared at the other end of the hall, his jaw tight, his phone still in his hand, Gianna knew the storm was not done. "They want a statement," he said quietly. Gianna sighed. "Of course they do. I can write it," Brandon continued. "My PR team can spin it. They'll bury the worst of it. You don't need to expose yourself any further." She looked at him, her heart catching at his protectiveness. He wanted to shield her. He always had. But this wasn't about him or even the board. It was about her. "No," she said softly but firmly. "If I let them speak for me, then they win. I can't hide Brandon. Not anymore." His eyes searched hers, conflicted. "And if they tear you apart again?" Gianna drew a slow breath, her gaze steady. "Then I'll survive it. Because I already have." 2 days later, she walked onto the stage of the Morning View studio. The lights were brighter than she had expected, hot against her skin, but her hands didn't shake. She wore no jewels, no designer armor, just a simple black dress. Her curls gathered, back her eyes steady. The host, Diane Keller, leaned forward with her practiced warmth. "Gianna Martinez, you've become an emblem of resilience, of second chances. But before Harbor, before all this, you were surviving. Can you take us there?" The room fell into a hush. Gianna could almost hear the hum of the cameras, the shuffle of unseen crew. She could feel Brandon somewhere backstage watching. And then she spoke. There was a shelter in Sacramento. She began, her voice soft but clear. "I was 16. No ID, no money. A baby cousin I was trying to protect after her mother overdosed. We weren't supposed to be there, but they gave us a floor and a blanket. That was the first time I realized survival wasn't about strength, but endurance. And sometimes about the quiet hope that someone might notice." Her voice didn't tremble. She let the truth flow, unvarnished, unpolished. The studio was silent, not with discomfort, but with the gravity of recognition. "And someone did notice," Diane said gently. "Yes," Gianna replied, her gaze steady. "Years later. A job in a house I almost didn't apply for. A child I hadn't expected to love. A man I hadn't expected to trust. Sometimes rescue doesn't come with sirens. Sometimes it comes with a crib and a lullaby." Diane leaned in. "And now," Harbor, Gianna's voice grew stronger. "Now the harbor exists, so others remember they deserve more than rescue. They deserve stability, joy, rest, things the world takes for granted. And yes, my past is messy, but it's real. And if I can carry that truth into something that saves even one more person from feeling invisible, then it was never just survival. It was preparation." When she finished, there was no immediate applause, only silence, the kind that came when truth sank into bones. Then slowly the sound rose, clapping standing, and a swell of voices that made the studio tremble. The clip went viral. Not the scandal, not the pity-laden article. Her words, her truth. Comments flooded in mothers, social workers, and foster kids now grown. You spoke my life. I didn't know someone like me could stand on that stage. Thank you for telling the truth. I never had the chance to. At the estate that evening, Brandon watched her from the doorway as she scrolled through message after message, her eyes glistening. She looked different now. Lighter, though not unscarred. Stronger, though not hardened. You were extraordinary, he said. I was honest, she murmured. Same thing, he answered, moving closer. When she looked up, his gaze held hers. Not as her employer, not as the man with power, but as someone finally stripped his armor and offered her the bare truth of himself. And in the stillness, Gianna realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Weeks passed. Harbor relaunched stronger, and its wait list is swelling beyond capacity. The Brown estate no longer felt like a mausoleum, but a place where life pulsed crayons on the kitchen island, the faint music of Brandon's piano drifting at night, Sofia's laughter carrying down the halls. One evening, as the sun set over the bay, Gianna found Brandon in the music room. He was seated at the piano, his fingers idly pressing keys, not playing a melody, but searching for one. She stood at the doorway, watching. You play? She asked softly. He looked up, almost sheepish. Used to. Before my father had convinced me that numbers paid better than notes. Play for me, she said. He shook his head. I don't know anything all the way through. Then we'll make it up. So they did. She sat beside him, her fingers stumbling across the higher keys, his laughter rumbling low when she pressed the wrong note. Together, they shaped a melody, halting, imperfect, but theirs. And somewhere between the broken chords and the laughter, something unspoken settled between them. Not just attraction, not just need, but love, the kind that was not loud or grand but steady. Brandon turned to her later that night on the terrace, the stars sharp above the bay. His voice was quiet but certain. I don't know what we are, he admitted, but I know I'm not afraid to find out. Her breath caught her heart, aching with the weight of his honesty. Slowly she reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. Neither am I. At that moment, they stopped surviving. They began living, and weeks later, at a Napa gala surrounded by chandeliers and whispered judgments, Brandon asked her to dance. She hesitated at first, the weight of so many eyes pressing against her. But then he whispered, Let them watch. You're the only one I see. So she stepped into his arms. And as they moved across the floor, she realized she no longer cared if the world whispered. Because sometimes love wasn't about building walls against storms. Sometimes it was about finding someone willing to stand with you in the rain. And so their story, messy and imperfect, continued. Gianna was no longer just the girl who had slept on floors. Brandon was no longer just the man in the suit of armor. Together they were building something that felt startlingly simple, a harbor. For Sofia, for Harbor's users, for themselves, and for everyone watching. It was a reminder that no past was too broken to heal, that no heart was too scarred to love, that no life was too fractured to be remade. If this story touched you, even just a little, don't forget to give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow this channel for more stories of love, resilience, and hope that linger long after the last word is spoken.